Continuing on the build, tonight we're going to start with our foot peg assemblies. Then we're going to move on to our controls, namely like the foot brake kip pedal, the front brake, and maybe we can end up with a carburetor. So we're going to start with our foot peg assembly here. So the cool thing about this guy, we're going to put it up in right now, is because it's got a center stand. The center stand is going to help us work with this, so it's not as tippy as it is now. So it'll be standing on this, and then the front tire will be in the chuck. So this is a great little thing to have, especially if you're going to work. It's really cool if you want to oil your chain, because you can just start rotating your rear tire and lubing that up. But we'll go with this. So I'm going to start getting our fasteners. We've got a lot of little parts and pieces that I got to clean up for our hardware, for our pivots points here, for our drum brake, and also our cable mounts. So let's dig in. Detail on our foot peg assembly. So off the website, it'll come with the rubber foot pegs here, which are great if you're just cruising around the yard, you're not really riding it very hard. And then as an option, we've got these metal, call them more of a dirt bike foot peg. So these are steel, and these are the ones you want to use if you're ramming. So I think on our particular bike here, we plan on having lots of fun and really beating the crap out of it. We're going to do some real good product testing. So we're going to go ahead and put our steel foot pegs on, so that way it'll hold up, because what happens with these rubber ones, if you really ride this hard and you've got your full body weight on this and you're trying to pinch the motorcycle and you're going through the whoop section, is these just slide, they'll start to slide off if you really ride them hard. If you're, like I said, if you're just cruising around the yard, taking it easy, these are really good. They're soft. They don't chew up the bottom of your sandals when you're riding. But we're going to switch over to the metal one. So I went ahead, grabbed our bolts. So we got 4 bolts here. Now this is very important that you don't get these too long, because what will happen, and we've seen it a lot on the original motors, is someone grabs a bolt like this that's too long, they go to screw it in, and it ends up punching holes in the bottom of the case. So then you'll be leaking, and then you just destroyed half of your motor, and you got to take the whole thing apart. But these ones right here are M8 by 16 millimeters long. Then we got the flange ones, so these are the ones we want to use. And then we've also got our buddy pegs here. We'll go ahead and put those on the back, because you always want to ride with your buddy. And we'll bolt them up. One detail to mention while we've got bolting this guy up is when you're doing the aftermarket engine swap, you will need to get the aftermarket foot peg assembly and or modify your original one. It's in depth. It's pretty intense to modify the original one. You pretty much got to cut the metal, space it out, and weld in a new one. So these are a nice, easy retrofit. And you can see how close we're getting here, to the clutch side, or the electric starter side, and then on the clutch side, it's really close too. So just a little detail. So if you're buying an aftermarket engine, you're going to do the swap, really got to get these foot peg assemblies here to actually fit the width of the motor. On the left side of the bike, the first thing we're going to go put on is going to be our shifter lever here. So for setting this is really just what feels comfortable for you. So it's a matter of angling this up or down, depending on how you ride or how your foot sets on the foot peg. So for me, I like to try to set them to where they're almost flush with each other, but maybe down just a little bit if I have to err any direction. Because when I'm riding, my toes are usually pointing down a little bit. So for me, that's a lot more comfortable. So we got to get this guy in, and then our next part here is going to be our sprocket cover. We're going to wait to put this on until we cut our chain. And then we've got to get our chain guard. And we'll go through the details of making that chain guard fit the aftermarket engine. For now, it's just the foot peg assembly and the shifter here. Onto our brake lever. So there's some options, and depending on what you have for a motor, you're going to have to make some decisions here on what you were going to do, because our OEM handlebars up top have a left lever. So on the H model here, that would have been the clutch. And we've got a semi-automatic. So if we choose not to do nothing, we can take our lever off, but we're still going to have our perch there, and that's just going to look weird. So what we're going to do is we're going to choose to get the 3-speed auto setup for the rear brake pivot. But there are other options depending on what you have. So we've got our Trail Buddy brake lever here with a bronze bushing inside, takes up the inside diameter and makes it fit the OEM pivot rod here. So this is a really good option to use. It also has the spacer back here to put it in the right distance. The newer model bikes, that part right there is quite a bit smaller because what they did is they got rid of the rear brake cable setup in the newer models. So for this one, there's our spacer here. But for this one, we're not going to, we typically use this one all the time when we have a 4-speed clutch. Clutch motors are really, really fun. More full-size motorcycle stuff. But for this one, we dug through our parts bin. Now we can use our standard lever part here. We've got to clean up all of our hardware yet, but this will turn on there and pivot. And then what part you're going to have to find would be this cable pull for the rear lever. So this will go behind here. And what it does is it's got that boss here as you pull the cable. So you hit your foot brake and then this moves and it doesn't touch where the cable mounts. And then when you go to pull the cable, what it does is it pushes against the lever here where the brake rod is mounted. So this guy we're going to have to add. And then that way, with the H model, they come with this little spacer here, which takes up this dimension if you were not for the H. So you wouldn't have that option for the H model because you don't have a rear cable brake setup. You've got a clutch on that side. So for this one, we're going to go ahead and use this. We got to clean up our hardware yet here. And what we did is we got all laid out. An important piece to check is the rear adjustment nut. Now it's got these little fish mouth pieces here that work with our little barrel. And what you want to do is make sure you replace that if it's all flattened out, because that keeps it from wanting to turn or rattle out when you're going down the road. And it's kind of nice to have brakes. So double check this guy. We have these on our site. This is a good thing to replace. And also our brake rod itself. We want to make sure that these threads are not messed up. So this one is a little bit chewed up. So maybe we'll run a die over top of this. I believe it's an M6. But you just want to make sure this, because you don't want to go ahead and put your new adjuster on here and you go to thread it down and it just galls up the inside of the threads. So this guy you want to make sure you've got good. We're probably going to want to run a die over ours because it is messed up a little bit. And we make sure our spring's good. And on a rear brake pivot rod, we want to make sure this isn't pinched in. And the splines broached or cut into this are still pretty good. So everything looks good. We just got to clean it up. And we'll go ahead and show you how to put it on. I'm gonna probably go grab a tap and run a tap through this rusty piece here because it was never used with the clutch model for the rear brake cable. And if you look in there, boy, hopefully I don't break a tap off. It's pretty nasty. But I'll grease up that tap and I'll run it through there and then we'll get everything bolted up. All right, we've cleaned up our pieces the best we can. So we're gonna put this guy on first. Then we've got our brake lever, and this just fits our foot peg assembly here. So got to get our lever on. All right, so note on here, there is a directional. So we've got our side here where our spring mounts. So that way it actually fits. All right. Then what these usually have on here is they'll have another washer and then a cotter pin. I'm going to go find my washer in my parts box, and then I'm going to go grab a cotter pin, and we'll be ready for our brake rod and our rear parts and pieces. So I've got my rear brake drum components roughly assembled here. So one thing I wanted to point out is when you adjust your rear brake rod, now when you do it, you're going to want to try to take pressure off of this so you don't end up flattening that fish mouth piece here on this nut. But when you start out without your chain on, you don't quite know where you're going to be in terms of your brake adjustment here in your slot. So leave this somewhat loose until you get your chain on and cut and put on, and then you can do your final adjustment when you get ready to put your chain on, because then you can set it, pull it against the chain good, get it square or perpendicular with the motorcycle, and then you can set this. So this is one thing I wanted to point out is don't go ahead and try to set this while you're setting this all up, because I've got my front brake pieces on. I go ahead and threw my springs on and just got this together. This is a little bit of a bear putting this arm on here. It is nice to do off of the motorcycle just so you can get at the nuts and bolts here, but there is a spline shaft and it's got some flats towards the bottom of the lever arm here. So you can only put this on in a couple different jumped positions. So if you find that you're out of brake or you've got too much, you can jump these a few tooth, front or back. Just one little thing. And if you get frustrated putting this together a little bit, don't worry. Even it's frustrating for me too, because you're holding the spring. It's got another little helper spring that right here that pushes this back. And it could be a little bit of a challenge. But just wanted to point that out. Do not set this until you get your chain cut and on, and then you can put this together here with your chain adjusters. So we've got our brake rod here all kind of loosely fit. So when we put our chain on, we can do our final adjustments. So now we're going to be on to our brake cable. So I'm going to go ahead and put it up in the lever perch up front, thread it in here, and then get this set, and then set it. So you won't be able to set this quite yet until you get your chain on. Obviously, when you put a brand new chain on, you're going to want to try to put this as forward as you can. So as the chain stretches, you're pulling this axle back. If you ever have any trouble adjusting this rear axle, you got to make sure that you loosen your axle nut. You can't just start wrenching on these chain adjusters here because you'll strip them right out. But loosen this up. And another thing, sometimes this little pivot rod here, this anti-pivot, this will freeze up a little bit and get super tight right here, and it won't allow it to pivot as you're pulling it back and forth. Here, see, it's kind of moving. Mine's all, I cleaned it all up. It's all new. So that's one thing. If you're struggling, look at this guy. If it's hard to move this back and forth. So we'll get our cable out of the bag, and we'll start routing our cable through to the back here. Okay, I've got the brake cable routed and down over here to my rear brake perch. It's kind of unique because we're putting a rear brake system on an H bike that never had one. So the threads inside here were really, really rusty. So I chased those threads with a tap, got that nice and clean so it's easily to adjust. And everything is still loose here. So that way I can push this down and I can pull that brake. Let's say I usually refer to it as a barrel at the end of the cable. And I could pull that down and around and snap that in. So what we've got here on this is it's just a really long piece of thread on our adjustment piece. So I'm going to put this way in. So that way when I start, it's a lot easier to adjust. I'll take care of that off camera. But the routing is we've got it to the left side, and then we mounted it to, or put it through the right of the speedometer and down through here. So this cable will eventually sit up. There's a nice chrome little clip thing right here that you run the cable through, and part of the front of that piece there. So that'll help get that managed nice, and that'll look a lot better. We don't have that put on right now, so we'll get that later. I know I was going to try to monkey around with the skid plate guard on this one. We're doing some prototyping with that, so I was going to leave that off to kind of see where we need to alter our chain guard piece. But that's the rear brake cable, how to put it in, setting it up for adjustment for the next stage. So we're onto our front. So if you're working with a basket case bike where it's something you didn't take apart, I wanted to show the difference here. So the rear lever arm is different than the front lever arm. So the front arm is about the same length, but it's skinnier here. And the spline for the rear has a big flat section to where it can only go on in a little bit of a rotation. The front can go anywhere. It's got all splines. So that's the difference of between the lever for the front and the rear. I know it's tough when you're working with something that you didn't take apart. It's always the worst. So getting this set is you want to be able to push it to where you can feel the brake shoes hit the drum. And you want your threaded rod to be, I don't know, about flush with the end. So that way when you put your barrel piece in here and then your fish mouth piece adjuster, there is all supposed to be a spring in here. I'm going to get that. But that way you know where you are roughly with your adjustment. So if you put new shoes on, sometimes there's a bit of a break-in period, and boy, sometimes these really seat, and that can move quite a bit. So you only got so much of adjustment here before you really start squishing the spring. If it really moves a lot and you're getting towards the end and that spring is just really, really squished, that's the time where you just want to pull this off the spline, rotate it or clock it to the front a bit, put it back on the spline, and then get it back to where you feel it just hit, and that's where you want to go. So I've got our pieces here, and I'll get those put in. I'm going to grab my spring and put my bolt through and my special fastener here in the back. That's the detail pieces of the front brake housing. Getting ready to put our speedometer cable on, and there is a difference that you want to look out for. The part that goes down on the lower hub is kind of a split fork here, and the part that goes up into the speedometer is a square cable that rides through the center. So when we're going to put this in, I usually like to go to the bottom first because I'll pull this out a bit and I'll set that in there till I feel that split line up with the gear inside, and then we're good to go. We're getting ready to install our 420 chain on our rear here. So what we have on the site is we've got chain lengths here that are longer than necessary. So that way you can cut it down to fit depending on your sprocket combination. So that's when you get into a situation where you may need a new chain, just because if you're going to go with a larger diameter here, or not so much in the front, because you know, a 1 tooth in the front is almost equivalent to 3 in the rear for sure. So if you start changing around with the rear sprocket, then you probably most definitely have to cut a new chain. So what we're going to use for that is we've got our chain breaker tool that we have on the website as well. So this works really, really well. What it does is it ends up clamping on to your chain, and then you just slowly move this in. You press that little riveted barrel, whatever the technical term is, it out. So what I like to do is I'll press on one side of the link, jump over to the other, and then press that in. Otherwise, it kind of like binds. If I find if you kind of equally push them, it works really, really well. So for here, we've got our chain and we've got our master link. So I'm going to go into a little bit of detail for the guys that really know how to do this. Probably skip this part, but that's fun to watch, I suppose. So we'll get it cut out. I'm going to go ahead and put gloves on because this is really, really greasy. We got a chain out of the bag, and what we're going to do is we're going to lay it over our sprocket assembly here. And we're going to figure out what length we want to cut this bad boy to. So we're going to make sure that we've got our axle all the way forward. Because when you put new chain on, they typically will have like a little bit of a break-in period. Now the better chain you get, the less it will stretch. So it's kind of a trade-off when you buy the less expensive or the cheaper option. That means that chain typically will stretch a lot faster or quicker. The little bit more, this JT chain that we have right here is a perfect middle of the road one, where this will stretch, but not near as much as some of the lower end stuff that's out there. or even that, say, the Parts Unlimited chain that we have on our website is pretty good, but with the higher CC motors, it'll you'll see just a little bit more stretching than the JT here. So we'll get this on, and then what we're going to do, I'm going to lay this here. I'm going to make sure I've got it as tight as I can. And I'm going to get ahead and cut the link here with our chain. So I'm going to go grab my marker, my paint marker, and put a little mark right here so I know which link I need to cut. Again, I'll probably double check to make sure I get this all the way forward before I cut that, because once you cut it, it's cut. And we'll go ahead and I'll show you how to use the tool. I've got my chain tool set up. We got the pressing pin inside here, and I've got that most of the way to the back. And this will grab right onto those links, and I'll turn this and it'll push that center pin right through. So I got the link that I marked, and I'll slowly get this pushed through. So like I said before, I kind of like to, you can push this all the way through, but it seems to work out better for me if I slowly start one, so that way it doesn't kind of get over traveled on one and the other. And there we go. So we've got our link off here. Press that through. We are now ready for our master link. So installing our master link. Now there is a right direction for this. So get this, chain jump. So get this together. And we'll talk, look at all that grease come out. All right. So we've got our back part of the master link. And we've got our little top portion here. Sometimes these hang up on that snap ring groove, but all right, so I've got that in, got that tight. And when we put our snap ring on here, there is a direction. So you want to put the back part here in the direction that the chain is going to roll. So that way, if we were to ever snag up on something, it can't, like if I hit it in this direction here, if it hit it, it could pop it right off. So the right direction is you always want to put it in this way, or this orientation. I get that set up, I get my little needle nose, and I'll pinch right here, and that should pop it right over. All right, I finally got that little bugger snapped in. It was fighting me every inch of the way. So I've got that on. Now the next step is here is I'm going to go ahead and adjust everything in my rear axle, and I'm going to make sure I've got enough links cut out. Again, the first few weeks that I'm going to be riding this, I'm just going to watch this because typically things kind of work their way in, and you just want to make sure that you're not slapping here onto your rear swing arm and making a mess of it, or your internal cases here towards your motor. So that is the chain installation of this. And I'm going to go ahead and tighten that, and we're moving on. So we've got everything in terms of our controls. We've got our chain cut, we got that installed, we got that put on, we've got our front brake in, our speedometer cable, and our rear brake setup. So it's starting to get exciting. It's starting to look like a real motorcycle. We're going to be getting pretty close here. So next time we're going to be working on that carburetor intake setup. We'll get our fuel switch in, and then we'll hopefully be riding. So I hope you liked everything you've seen here. You can find more of these parts and pieces on mytrailbuddy.com.